Hi everybody, it's Tony Conley. Welcome to the debut episode of Tony Conley Talks. This is going to be a daily music journal that I'm going to pop up at noon Eastern Standard Time every day on Facebook. And it'll be a nice digestible way for you to find out my thoughts on what's going on in rock and roll, what's gone on in rock and roll. And I know a lot of you followed me for so many years on Rock Guitar Daily. That was a long running 10-year episode of music journalism in which I was doing very long interviews. I was doing really long record reviews, and as time marched on, what we've found is people are reading a lot less and they're watching a lot more. Also, about 18 months ago, I got felled by a terrible case of prostate cancer, and I've been on my back fighting that for almost 2 years. But now I'm back at it, and I'm super thrilled to be here. And well, let's just dive right in. Today we're going to be talking about what might be for some a very touchy subject. I'm going to take on the Beatles. I'm taking on the Beatles Abbey Road remasters and remixes. Some of it I love, some of it I'm not so crazy about, but let's get into it and talk about it a little bit. First of all, I will say that the best part of this package is the outtakes. What an amazing set of documents that reveal the Beatles to be an amazingly effective rock and roll band when they were live in the studio. And the benefit of them being outtakes is you have the great engineering that was happening at Abbey Road, but you have no angel dust. You have nothing sprinkled on it. You have no sonic expansion that's been added to the new remixes and remasters. We'll talk about that a bunch more, but I will say that you could make an incredible album. You could make an album that was certainly better than Let It Be out of these outtakes. And at the end of this episode, I'm going to go through and I'm going to tell you my picks for if you want to put together your own Abbey Road out of the outtakes, which might just blaze the official release. You'll want to check it out. What can I say about the new remix and remaster? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the official release. I'm a little disappointed in a lot of things about the way that it sounds. There's a lot of additive EQ. There's a lot of very strange stereo placement in the stereo field where instruments occur. I'm a traditional guy. I like to envision a band on a bandstand recording in front of me, and I'm experiencing it with the sound coming at me. That really doesn't happen with the remixes of, any of Giles Martin's remixes. They're interesting, but they're not a cohesive rock product to my ears. And I have to say, where in God's name is the legacy of Jeff Emmerich? It's certainly a shame and a pity that he wasn't included in these packages. Jeff was, as you know, an associate of mine. He loved this stuff like nobody loved this stuff. And he was passionate about it. He knew what was good. He knew what he would like to go back and fix, but he never got the chance to. He was cut out of the process. I can't say why, but oh, what a grand mistake this was. And why was that a grand mistake? Because Jeff Emmerich was the greatest recording engineer in the history of rock and roll. His sense of mic placement, tones coming out of instruments and voices, and their placement in the stereo field when he did most of the mixing on the Beatles stuff that he worked on. George Martin didn't do mixes. He stood behind while the mixes were made. He approved or didn't approve, but the work was being done by Jeff Emmerich. And, you know, if you listen to his history of work with the Beatles, you'll certainly see that revealed. I'm going to say this now and get it out of the way. And probably, you know, if you want to throw things at me and you want to cuss at me, now would be the time, because I'm going to come right out and say, I just don't believe Giles Martin is a tremendously musical fellow. What he does so often is, you know, he's done what so many remix remasters have done, And he's used a tremendous amount of additive EQ. And what this does, it makes everything louder and it has more presence. And people think that's better. But, you know, we learned that over the last 20 years with the compression wars. We learned that having a volume that was always this big was not a good thing, because music is dynamics. Music is sounds that wrap around you and make you want to make love to them. And when you're going as fast as you can for as long as you can, well, you know, that's not a very good trip, right? You got to have some soft spots. You got to have dynamics. It has to go like this, because it breathes, it pulses. It's just like a human being. Music is like that. Let's go through a few selected cuts and see exactly what I think and why I think that about that. And we'll start with, what I'll do is I'll talk about this new release. I'll talk about the outtakes from these releases, and I'll also talk about the 2009 remaster, which was a wonderful product. Let's start with Come Together. And I'm going to jump right to the outtake and say, wow, this is maybe the best recording of John Lennon's voice that I've ever heard. It's passionate, it's humorous, it's forceful, and the sounds and the tones on the outtake are just remarkable. Ringo's toms and cymbals are perfect here. You hear them in their pristine condition as they exist in nature. Nothing added, nothing taken away. And my God, it's a gorgeous, gorgeous sound. You go to the 2000 remaster, and it's a great sounding document. I don't think it sounds as good as the outtake, but it's the best version of Come Together officially released that I've heard. 2019, to be honest, the drum tone is shit. It's shite. It's outrageously big. It's in your face. By the second verse, the toms are really gross and distracting. And as you know, the thing that makes Ringo Starr such a beautiful, beautiful drummer, one of the best we've ever known, is his taste, is his tone, it's his style. And they captured that, you know, so beautifully. And to have that, you know, puffed up, it's almost like a normal person in an Arnold Schwarzenegger suit, and it didn't resonate with me. It doesn't resonate with me, and I'll be talking a bit more about that, but let's move on. Let's go to the George Harrison moment. Something. You know, some say the greatest love song ever written. I wrote a chapter in a book that I have coming out. It didn't come out because I had a little trip with cancer, but I wrote a chapter for the book that's called Paul and George. And the crux of the chapter is that George got more benefit from Paul's knowledge, experience, and talent than, you know, anybody but maybe John. He helped George tremendously in the studio. You know, you go back to Taxman, where George couldn't quite capture a solo, so Paul went in and said, hey, let me have a whack at it. And George was like, okay. But what Paul did was he uncorked a remarkable solo, one of the best ever. And the best part of the solo is he threw in some mystical sounding, Eastern influenced guitar licks as a tip of the hat to his musical partner, George. You know, their history is interesting, but I think it's a lot more collegial, musical, and joyful than you usually see written down. On something, on the 2009 remaster, Paul's bass line and his background vocals on something are beyond remarkable. They're two of the best performances in rock history, recorded rock history. His bass line was so innovative because he went back after the fact, after the tracks were laid, and then he put down his bass track, piece by piece, moment by moment, you know, very very rigorously late at night after everybody else went home. He's making George's classic perfect. But on the new release, well, quite frankly, the bass is muddy. It's furry. I really have a hard time hearing anything, coming out of Paul's left hand, and that's what I want to hear because he's such a percussive bass player. He plays with such great accents, great staccato. He knows when to begin and end a note, and some of that is lost on the new remix. If you listen close, and you go back and you listen to the 2009 remaster, you'll hear the difference, and you'll hear that while it's not as big and boomy as it is certainly on the new remix and remasters, it's more toneful and more meaningful to the song. Musically, on something, George's guitar solo is his best known and maybe his best ever. But here, Giles has killed the nuance of the solo by pumping up the frequency range and the volume to the point where I can't really tell that, that's a Fender Stratocaster and it's going into a Fender amp. And if you're a music person, if you're a guitar guy like me, that means everything. And when I hear what's happened on this new remix remaster, I can't really tell what he's playing through, what he's playing. It's just lost so much of the nuance. It doesn't sound buttery and smooth like it did on earlier releases. And you just can't hear the strat tone that so defines the solo. And then there's Paul and George's singing together. And on something, it may be the greatest recorded example of Paul and George singing harmonies together. And, as you move on in the song, Paul gets more and more intense. And on the 2009 release, you can hear it. It's angelic, it's charming, it makes you feel warm and fuzzy all over. And it's kind of glossed over actually on the new version. It's cool, but you lose much of what made it so brilliant. It's still great. You're gonna want it. You're gonna love it. But if you compare the two and you equal out the volumes, so the 2009 release is as loud coming out of your stereo as the new release, you'll hear the tonal variations, and I think they're huge, and I think it makes a big difference, and I think that's a lot of what's going on here. Let's move on to Oh Darling, on the outtake. The bass tones are simply to die for, and on the re-release, they're a little muddy and indistinct. And again, George's amp sounds like a Fender on the outtake. And you can hear the notes actually kind of reverberating within the cabinet of the amp, and it's glorious. It's glorious. On the new mix, Ringo's hi-hats, all the dynamics are gone, and that's what you want from Ringo's playing is the dynamics, because he did that better than any rock drummer in history. He knew when to hit hard, he knew when to hit soft. He had John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Jeff Emmerich, George Martin, wow, some great musical minds directing him. No drummer in history ever had that. Closest we probably have is John Bonham with Jimmy Page. But, it created something that is just timeless. Moving on, we're getting on in time here, and I don't want to keep you too long, but again, on Here Comes the Sun, another track where Paul's bass is so superb on the demo. You can actually hear the pick hitting the string. And, while it lacks some low end, that was the way it was recorded in those days. It wasn't quite as blown up as it is now. Bass amps weren't so big in frequency, and they were a little more direct, and they fit a little better in a mix. But listen for yourself and see what you think. Moving on to Polythene Pam. On the demo, wow, George. This is, George is on fire on this record when he's playing guitar. It's almost a hard rock performance throughout the album. George changed as a guitar player. He hadn't been playing guitar. He'd been playing sitar for a couple of years. Abbey Road, he kind of said, "Hey, I'm going to show you what I'm really about." And George's performance on the album is superb from beginning to end. You know, no matter where you put it on, George did an amazing job. And then moving into "She Came In Through the Bathroom Window," on the outtakes, this is some of George's best rock guitar playing. And again, you can hear the gear he's playing through, you know. And that's a huge thing for people who are into music, as anything other than, you know, background noise. Again, Ringo's dynamics are pretty much destroyed on the re-release, but on the outtakes, wow, you hear everything that made Ringo the king. I'm not going to go over much more of the album. You get where I'm going with this. You see what I think. You know, that you'll want to own this. You'll want to listen to it. It's interesting and it's good. It's not great. When I hear the Beatles, I want fucking great. And it was. If you go back and you listen to what was captured by the greatest engineers, and I've spoken with Jeff Emmerich. We spent time talking about how he recorded everything, how he set up the mics. One of the great things about the Beatles were they didn't often demo the songs as a band until they got in the studio. So what that meant was, you know, they might be most of the day working out an arrangement. Well, what that did, you know, if you're not recording, you're getting ready to record. Jeff Emmerich knew this, and he worked diligently on guitar tones. He was twiddling the knobs as they were playing. He was taking mics up and back. He was putting mics, ambient mics, into the mix. He did a lot of things which had never been done, including the fact that Paul was even overdubbing bass lines onto music. Nobody had ever done that before. Paul was really the first bassist who would go back after the tracks had been recorded, late at night usually. He and Jeff would sit down and they would go through the music bar by bar, if they had to, note by note, and Paul would create the perfect bass line. Henceforth, Paul is known by a lot of people as the greatest bass player in rock history. And boy, he's got my vote. You know, there's a lot of great guys. Jack Bruce, Entwistle, so many great guys. Paul's right up there. And Paul's also a great guitar player. I know this is Paul-centric, but Paul was the studio Beatle. You know, that's incontestable. He was there. He was putting in more time. He spent more time learning about tones, textures, where they go. Paul wanted to know everything. George and John, not so much. John had no interest. George was just learning because he had been, you know, kept somewhat in the shadows by the incredible light shined by John and Paul. What a songwriting team, what a harmonizing team. Oh my God, when they came together eye to eye, nobody ever sang like that together. The best two male voices, you know, in history. You know, fight me. The Everly Brothers, maybe. You know, the Beach Boys, sure. John and Paul had it. But it wasn't always about the singing. Let's talk about the end. And the end is so interesting because, you know, I'm going to talk about three versions here. I'm going to talk about 2009. And on the 2009 remaster, they really got it right. And, you know, it's funny because if you hear it, you almost go, it's funny. When they get to the guitar solos, they're all right here in the stereo mix. And you go, wow, that's kind of funny. But not funny if you ever talk to Jeff Emmerich, because he'll tell you, Tony, I had three Fender Twins. They were sitting side by side by side. They were almost touching. They weren't 2 inches apart. I mic'd them individually and had the guys play. And that's what it was. It was a jam. It was their one of their final jams where they were like, okay, boys, we're back in the Cavern Club. Let's see who can play. And on the 2009 thing, they got it really right. Interestingly, on the outtakes, you don't get the solos. You just have the bed track. But, oh, it sounds so beautiful. And once again, it was captured so well that you'll listen to it over and over, even though the whole point's kind of missing from the song. but you're gonna dig it and you're gonna listen to it a lot. Let's talk about the 2019 version. Fuck the 2019 version of The End, okay? And here's why. Once again, Ringo, I love you. You're one of the best drummers in rock history. You have the best sound in rock history, and it's been thrashed. It's gross overkill. You know, it's just you're being assaulted so that if you really notice it, you'll notice that your shoulders start to rise and you're experiencing a little bit of sonic anxiety, and you're going, wow, that's really kind of strange. Where's that coming from? And it's where they've pumped up everything to where there's no room for it to breathe, and you want that room to breathe. And then let's talk about the guitars. And again, the brilliance of the guitars being side by side by side, and you hear what actually happened, and you actually know what happened in that moment. Well, on the remix, as I listened, excuse me, I noticed something kind of odd. And it was, you know, Paul takes the first solo, and it literally sits down here in the mix. You know, it's a little, you know, stage left. George is up here. Funny placement, but that's kind of where it sounds to my ears. And then right in the middle you have John Lennon, which is cool. But the way they've done the spatiality and the stereo mix, which is wider, and god damn it, all this great technology, and unfortunately you didn't invite Jeff Emmerich, you didn't have a great mix engineer on board, and as a result, a guy like me is a little bummed out about it, because instead of hearing that Cavern Club closeness, you hear a really dichotomous view of the recorded guitars that doesn't sound like they're playing on a soundstage, and that's not what I want from this experience, because that's not what it was. You know, if you hear them talk about and you check out what was said in interviews, The End, you know, this was like, they made Yoko leave the room. God damn, they made Yoko leave the room and said, me and the boys are going to have a bit of fun. You know, and they did, and you can hear it. And it's amazing. Go check out the 2009 remaster. Throw it up against the 2009 reissue. Let me know what you think. I'm going to catch some crap for this, but hey, I'm sticking with my guns, and I will talk about every bit of this, and I will defend it, and I will tell you why, as a guitar player, as a musician, as a listener, as a person who spent 5 years listening intensely to the Beatles while I was writing the Paul McCartney in the Beatles book, which is hopefully coming out in 2020, by the way. It's a great book. You're going to love it. I've probably kept you long enough. This has ran over 20 minutes, but hey, we're talking about the Beatles here. So now I'm going to go through and I'm going to tell you the tracks I would select and sequence if I was going to do an album of the outtakes from the Abbey Road Remix remasters. I'd start off, as the album does, with Come Together. Then I'd move into I Want You, She's So Heavy, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. Then there's Paul's beautiful, beautiful ballad, Goodbye, which he gave to Mary Hopkin. Didn't keep it for the record, didn't keep it for the Beatles. Octopus's Garden. It's amazing in the outtakes. You're going to love that to death. Another Paul demo, Come and Get It, the million seller for Badfinger. Paul did this demo in an hour in the studio, and it's one of the best sounding tracks on the package at all, and he did it in an hour by himself. He came in before the other Beatles got to a session, and he knocked out this demo for Badfinger. And of course, Badfinger said, well, we want to do some different things with it. And Paul said, no, leave it alone. This is a hit. And it was. From there, Polythene Pam, remarkable on the outtakes. Then you're going to want to hear The End. No solos, but it is the end. And it sounds amazing, and you're going to want to hear it. I want to go back to I Want You, She's So Heavy. The outtake of this song is probably going to become one of my favorite Beatle recordings, because what it reveals is that the Beatles were one of the greatest live rock and roll bands in history. And I wish to God that they had made it into the era in which, bands on stage had monitors, good sound systems. The Beatles never heard themselves playing live once they left the Cavern Club. They were playing for thousands of people. They didn't have monitors. They were playing through small amps. They grew to hate it because John can't hear Paul, who can't hear George, who can't hear Ringo. And it's not much fun when you're having to look at each other for cues as opposed to just feeling and playing the music. And that was one of the beauties of the Beatles, was in their symbiotic relationship as four fellas able to get in a room and play music. They did it like it had never been done. And this is probably best revealed in these outtakes from this record. And, I'm sorry to say it, but I don't think I'll listen to the remix, remaster 2019 version again. It's interesting, but it's not beautiful. It's not tremendously musical. It's not as musical as it could be. I'm very, very disappointed by that. Opportunity lost, and I guess this is just what we're left with. And I know I'm going to face some heat on this, and people are going to say, no, it sounds great. And I'm going to go, let's sit down and talk about this. Let's dissect this. Let's take it apart, really look at it. Yeah, the outtakes win the day. I'm anxious to hear what you say, but that's how I see it. If you want to hear the best experience of an official Abbey Road remix, remaster, whatever, go to the vinyl. Go to the 2009 remaster. That's where the gold is. And a lot of history's changing for not good reasons. A lot of it has to do with legacies and things, money and things, egos and things, and I don't give a flippin' frackin' fuck about that. I'm talking about the music. That's all Tony Conley cares about. He cares about the music. He doesn't care about, people are gonna really love it. It's gonna boom out of their cars, or da-da-da-da-da-da. The legacy of Giles Martin, who's just like George Martin. My ass, he's not. I'm sure he's a good fellow. I'm sure he's a excellent producer, mixer, good in the studio. He's not the best ever, and the Beatles had the best ever. And that's what's missing in this package. Let me know what you have to say. Thanks for sticking with me. If you've stuck with me for so long, this has turned into a half-hour episode. I thought it was going to be 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Well, it blew up on me, but there's no other way to handle this. So I hope you stick with us. Listen to this when you have some time. If you made it through to the end, thank you for listening. I'm going to do a lot of stuff with this. We're going to have some interesting guests in the future with some split-screen interviews and lots of fun stuff. But I'm just getting back into the game. It's going to take me a few episodes to get a little handsomer background, a little better sound, a little less reflection in my glasses. But I'll catch up to you as soon as the budget and my time is able. I've just come through this whole cancer thing, and this is my first dive back in the water. And I'm insanely happy to be doing this and talking to you at all. And I hope you tune in for the rest of the week. I've got some interesting things I've got coming up on meeting Michael Schenker. I worked for Michael as a guitar tech. He's one of my favorite guitar players in history. And I'm going to tell the tale of how that all came together. And then the day after that, I'm going to talk about an episode I'm calling You Did What with Bobby Womack? And it goes into some of the history of Bobby and I. And then there'll be an episode about Uli John Roth and how he saved my family without even knowing it. It'll be a surprise to him as well as it will be to you. And then on Friday, I'm going to come up with a special episode where we're going to have a special announcement. I'm probably going to be doing an interview. It's going to be something to see. Thanks for joining me. We're clocking in right at a half hour here. I'll keep these shorter in the future, but hey, it's the Beatles. It's Abbey Road. It requires some discussion. I love you all. Thanks for joining me. Peace be with you. Have a wonderful week.